I'm going to open with this. Now, when you're researching plastic and what's going on, all the charts look the same. They all look like this. This is what the last, 50, 60 years has been doing to us. And, there's been a lot of amazing innovations with plastic. We are in the plastic age. But unfortunately, I would say about 2 billion of that is single-use stuff. It's wasteful, problematic plastic. And it's endangering the world. And one of the things I was telling Caroline, I said I wanted to visualize what 2 billion pounds of plastic looks like. And so I put it in ChatGPT last night. And I said, how many Rose Bowls could I fill up with that amount of plastic? Came back at 140,000. So then I was like, well, gosh, I still can't visualize that. What does 140,000 Rose Bowls look like? 20 acres each, that's 4,000 square miles. Good God, what does it take to drive around that much space? That's 66 miles. Imagine driving 66 miles, looking out your left window at a Rose Bowl height wall of plastic. Driving 66 miles, turning left, driving 66 more miles, turning left again, 66 more miles. Imagine, that's what it looks like. When you see a stock chart that goes parabolic, that usually means there's a crash coming. The problem here is that the crash is our planet. So, Caroline, how did it get so big? By the way, Caroline just came out of Yale, so the environmental school science. So I trust her a lot.
There are a lot of not so great people who also come out of Yale. So please don't let that be our criterion. So I think what scares me most about that is not just what that means for the amount of plastic that's wound up in our oceans, lakes, and rivers, and on our highways, but what it has meant for how much we've built our society on these plastics. So very similar to the fossil fuel conversation, like fossil fuels built our society, and in a lot of ways plastics did the same. I mean, it is a ubiquitous material because it is effective, it is versatile, it is durable, it is hygienic. It's filled, our grocery stores are filled with plastics, our hospitals are filled with plastics, our closets are filled with plastics. So and it's really cheap. I should also mention it's really, really cheap. So it's really good at what it does. So we've built our society on, honestly, a really miraculous material. We owe a lot of progress to plastics. And part of the beauty of it being durable is also the horror of it being durable, right? It's durable in our oceans, and it's durable on the sides of our highways, and it's durable in our bodies. Very, very scary stuff. So I think what scares me in part is if we've built a society and an economy on plastic, that also means we have to rebuild our economy on something else in a lot of places. We're gonna have to find a lot of replacement material for stuff. I'm sure that this sweater I'm wearing has like rayon and other, plastic materials in it, because this was something I could afford, and something that was, pure cashmere was probably something that I couldn't afford, So, I mean, there are a lot of materials that we could be using instead. In some applications, there are other areas where we don't have the replacement materials yet. If you go into hospitals and ask nurses, like, could you replace this with something reusable or made of bamboo? They'd be like, I don't think so. There's a lot of plastic in our lives, and we have to figure out how to do something different with it. And that, to me, feels like the most daunting challenge.
When it comes to cost, there's a reason it's cheap. It's because we've been subsidizing oil, and we've been putting incentives in the wrong places. We have not been incentivizing source reduction. We haven't been incentivizing a whole bunch of other things that would have countered the volume of plastics that we're now seeing. So when people say the word cost, we have to go backwards. What does that cost mean? It's not including environmental cost. And that's why I really got excited about extended producer responsibility, because it extends the responsibility of the life cycle of the product for the producer all the way through the life cycle. So they can't just externalize these costs onto the ocean, onto the environment, and onto government. They have to internalize those costs. Then you have a true cost. In a free market, if you're buying something that doesn't include that full life cycle cost, you really aren't sending the right market signal, because if you had the full cost in there, you might buy something else. And that's the problem now, is we've got socialized costs instead of one-to-one. So if you choose to buy a product, the price should be the full price and the cost of doing business, and then the local governments are going to get reimbursed and compensated for doing the work that the producers of the packaging are going to impose on them by having to do the collection and the sortation and the management.
This is the thing that scares me the most, because when you go to undeveloped countries, especially in the global south, they do not have waste management, and they will not be getting any kind of good waste management anytime soon. And that is whose waste, Heidi?
It's ours, a lot of it. And we know, the companies know who are selling products there, that they don't have the infrastructure to manage it properly. And that's infuriating, because they know that they're just making money off of pollution, really.
Yeah.
I think what makes that worse is it is not only ours, but our waste, when we say we recycle our waste, we're sending it to Indonesia and we call it recycling, and that's what it looks like. And then when it piles up like this, then they light it on fire and burn it to get rid of it. And so I think Amy was saying on the previous panel, transparency. Transparency is absolutely key when we talk about recycling, and I'm very proud to be a part of the Newsom administration who just vetoed a bill that would have allowed the industry to continue to utilize those same definitions of recycling in the implementation of our new plastic packaging legislation. And so incredibly proud of being a part of this team that's going to really insinuate transparency into the system and really force that honest conversation. So I'm so inspired today, this whole group. This is such an incredible conversation to be having. Just to get to your question though, on what is most frightening, and when we're thinking about what we can do and do better, 50% of our greenhouse gases are created by fuel and energy, but the other 50% is caused by consumption. And that isn't, for me, it isn't about creating a guilt trip. It is about very much thinking about when we talk about plastics and turning off the tap, that the oil industry, as has been well noted today, is very, very smart at their branding. And they are moving from fuel to plastic, and they're moving really fast. And they saw this transition happening more than a decade ago, and they're making the transition, and they see it and they get it. And by 2050, we will more than that chart that you just saw there will more than double. And so for us, what we can do, and Californians are doing a really good job of this, because the reason that legislation passed last year was because Californians got fed up and put a measure on the ballot and said, no, we're going to tax plastics, and we are putting our foot down. And the legislature responded, and the governor responded, and they passed legislation that CalRecycle is now implementing to say, no, Californians going to set the stage so that we can put a halt. But if you look at what's happening on the world stage as the UN is trying to negotiate the plastics pact, and I've been listening to a lot of these conversations, the APAC nations are really trying to halt that. So that is where advocacy could be key, and that's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, and you touched on it, because the Indonesia thing, and before that it was China, and then China closed the door on us. And one of the most troubling things about our system here at home right now is that we're very good at burying our waste. We have trash trucks that come every week and pull our trash away from us, and we put it in our blue bins, and we think it's getting recycled, but this is the current reality, right? After COVID, it's dropped to 4%, which is just atrocious. Nationally, that's an OECD, yeah, okay? So, poor CalRecycle, that's a hot seat you're in when you see a stat like that, Rachel, right? Like, oh my gosh, how do we change this? But fortunately, this legislation, which is law, but it's still being shaped, is now doing that. We're talking about designing, the EPR is really about designing a system that works, right? And we talk about these priorities. Number one, reduce the volume of plastic, shift the burden of cost. So let's get into the nitty-gritty here. You guys all live and operate, John, your company, Cruz, when I look at a closed loop system here, tell me first of all the motivation for you, why you started, and your current challenges and where you're trying to fit into this thing, because you are an innovator.
Yeah, why I got into this is a similar thread of what you've heard today. I'm a surfer. I am tied to the ocean. My background's in chemical engineering, materials engineering, and I've told this story a few times, but I went to college thinking I'd be a petroleum engineer. And it's really interesting when you go and you have certain life experiences, some of them good, some of them very bad, it brings clarity into what's important in your life. And that really shifted my perspective on what I wanted to do and how I wanted to influence and bring meaning to my career and my life path. And Cruz Foam really came about through that seed that was planted in that junior year. This was 2007. I didn't found Cruz Foam until 2017. And in between that period, I graduated in 08. It was the hardest time period to find a job. And I stuck to my laurels, and I got a job that paid me about 50% what I expected coming out of college, but it was environmental engineering. And I worked and did environmental engineering for 6 years and really understood not the whole problem, but got a really good glimpse for those 6 years, working and doing work for the EPA, working for the Air Force, the Navy, a lot of different large government agencies, but doing both the work in the field, doing the actual remediation, and then interfacing with actual legislation regulators. And it gave me such a good understanding of where this was not moving quick enough. And the things that we were focusing on, in a lot of ways, made absolutely no sense. Groundwater is very important, but groundwater that is in the middle of the desert, that there's not 200 people around, and we're spending an enormous amount of money to go remediate this groundwater, I just feel like there's a lot of other things that are more priority than that in this moment. And when I went back to school, I met my co-founder and I got exposed to this incredible material called chitin. And it's the second most abundant biopolymer on the planet. It comes from shrimp, also things like lobster, crab, fungi, insects. And really what we saw was this huge issue around materials. On the face of it, you look at the waste and you say, okay, we got to clean up this waste. But the whole title of this talk is on point to where we really wanted to tackle this problem. It's about turning off the tap. You can't just look at this as a singular entity of playing catch up. You have to look at the true circular nature of materials and the impact they have, not just in the end, but the middle and the beginning, and how that's undoubtedly connected. And what we really wanted to focus on was not only making a fantastic material, but how do we do this in a way where it activates the middle, which is the manufacturing, allows this enormous and gorilla of infrastructure and industry that's been created over 100 years. How do we activate them? How do we get them involved in the conversation? How do we accelerate this with partnership? But then the next level is, where do we understand where we're taking these materials? How do we understand the impact that exists? Because a lot of times the materials we source are from undeveloped countries. So not only are they getting the socioeconomic impacts of the sourcing and what that involves, but then the waste ends up on their doorstep. They're getting the double whammy. And so when we really saw this, we can make a great material, but if we're not doing it the right way from the beginning, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, it's just not going to have the levels of change at the rate that they need to have, at the scale that they need to have.
Caroline, you spend a lot of your days working with companies now at Atlantic to improve their circularity in their packaging.
Yeah, I feel like I came into the packaging industry at such a perfect time as this legislation was coming down the pipe. 2 of these EPR laws passed in 2021, and then 2 more passed in 2022. California obviously made the biggest splash as the biggest economy in 2022. And Heidi really hits the nail on the head with this, because so many of the problems that we have environmentally are these externalities that are disproportionately felt by marginalized communities, and that we as citizens wind up paying to clean up. And EPR is such a beautiful policy mechanism because it is going to help bring those costs back into the supply chain where they belong, and instead of on citizens. So this makes so much sense. I chat with companies fairly often and say, are you aware of this? And a lot of times they say, I've heard about it, but I don't really know what it means. And I try to say, I don't want to panic you, but this is probably the biggest shift that you have seen in the packaging industry in your career. And I know it's, a young person coming in saying like, hey, this is going to be a big change, but this is going to be a really big change. And to the point Wes was making at the end of the previous panel, this is really going to change their decision-making calculus about the cost of packaging. So as we're thinking about what it means to move from a more difficult to recycle material that is maybe really, really cheap today, like a single-use flexible film plastic, to maybe a more recyclable option, maybe that's a paper option. A lot of the time, that material may be more expensive right now, but EPR is going to change how expensive these materials are for companies. And so while we don't have the exact fee structures yet, I am confident that this is going to change the decisions that companies make about what kind of packaging that they use. And really, so far what we've talked about is the theory of EPR. The theory of EPR is we can help internalize these costs and incentivize recyclability, and that's so exciting. And now comes the really hard part, which is getting it right. And thankfully I get to talk to amazing people like Heidi and Rachel, who are working really hard on getting this right. And so we need to make sure that as we are working towards implementation, that we actually incentivize recyclability, that we actually put the funds that come back into the system towards rebuilding recycling, towards improving composting, and towards ensuring that recycling is more accessible to the vast majority of people. I live in an apartment. I don't know about y'all, but there are a lot of households that have access to recycling, a lot of apartments that don't. And I mean, I know when I put my recycling outside my door, it is really hard to know where the hell that goes. And I feel like there's a particular lack of transparency in multifamily homes. This particularly affects people who are lower income, who are more likely to be renters, more likely to be living in multifamily homes. This is just one of the many problems that we're really hoping that funds coming into the EPR system hopefully helps address.
Okay, so thank you, Caroline. It's awesome. These are the driving pressures of extended producer responsibility. The driving pressures that we're putting on the system and how we're going to clean this thing up, right? This is the goal. First of all, huge kudos, Heidi, for getting this thing passed, because I know you played a massive, massive role on this. And this is one of the biggest things ever. I mean, we've got a lot of storytellers in this room. When you want to talk about a story that's worth telling, this could be, it already is, but it could be very grand if we get this right. So.
Yep. And it wasn't, I mean, there's so many people that were involved in this. There was, I think, 25 of us in the negotiating room in the last year. But as Rachel mentioned, that ballot measure that was put on the ballot drove the industry to the table to negotiate. If we had not had that threat on the ballot, we would never have gotten in this bill reuse and refill targets, the first in the country, 2% and then 4%. But that doesn't sound like much, but what you remember about when I was a kid, we actually had refillable bottles. We had things like the milk was in a refillable bottle. Nothing, all of it was pretty much dismantled, and we have to rebuild all of that. So those are real targets. We have real source reduction of plastics, 25%. Who thought that we would be able to get that? That's kind of an incredible number. The recycling targets are high. The year before we passed the bill, we co-sponsored it, saying if you call it recyclable, you can't, and with the chasing arrow, you cannot, it has to hit 60% basically, there's a formula, of recyclability. Like you can't just throw the arrow on there and call it recyclable if it's not. And that means that you will be able to buy things that are, it's telling you the truth on the label, so you can put the compostables in the composting bin, and you can put the recyclables in the recycling bin and think, yeah, they're pretty much gonna get recycled and composted, which is great.
And this is a good point, and I'm just gonna turn to this slide while you're on that, because you touched on it, so I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah.
But this was really the first step before SB54 was the truth in labeling for the recycling logo. If everybody's familiar with the recycling logo that's out there, it's basically resin codes, right? And
Yep.
which ones are recyclable? Like when you look at those things, how many of you know which ones are which?
Well, and I can tell you, the Recycling Commission, which I chaired for 2 years, is 1 and 2, plastics. That's what we determined. Everything else is basically not.
Right. And so a person like me who doesn't know that stuff, I remember growing up in the 70s and seeing the anti-litter campaigns and then being really excited about seeing the ushering in the recycle logo. I guess I wasn't keeping up with things because the resin code thing just went way over my head.
And just so you know, the American Chemistry Council actually lobbied and went state by state to get many states to pass this rule to require the chasing arrow to be on the containers to fool you.
Mm-hmm. So this first step, this first transparency step, which is SB343, is really going to simplify the recycling thing. In 2025, if it's not actually being recycled, that logo will not be on the product.
That's right.
So that is huge.
Yes.
So that was the table setter for SB54, right? And Heidi, I want you to walk us through this because it's, you don't have to go granular, but the highlights.
I think the highlights are the backdrop that we made sure that everything sold has to be recyclable or compostable to our definition by 2032. Everything sold in California. And because we're the 4th largest economy in the world, that super matters to companies. They are not going to just say, oh, well, we're not going to sell in California. They're going to basically change their lines for the whole country is going to benefit from this law. So that's very exciting. The 65% recycling rate by 2032, that's a hard stop, it has to hit. The 25% of plastics getting recycled, and of course the industry fought very hard and said, oh, we want to do recycled content, and that's going to hit the goal. And I'm like, recycled content is a market driver. It's not source reduction. It's not turning off the tap. So we limited that and called it an alternative. So it's not source reduction. And then we have some other tools that they can use, but these are some, I've never seen a bill that not only did all this, we got $5 billion from the plastics industry to pay California in 10 annual chunks of $500 million a year that are going to go to our state agencies and our disadvantaged communities and rural communities to clean up all the pollution from plastic packaging. That is unbelievable, and it's only because we had the ballot measure. If we had not had the ballot measure, that would never have been negotiated, but the threat of the tax did it. So,
Yep.
yeah, go California.
Okay, so a little wonky here about how this whole thing's gonna work, which is what's called, it's setting up what's called a producer responsibility organization. Now, when I first heard about this, and Caroline was explaining this to me, I was kind of like, wait a minute, you mean the regulated are gonna become the regulators? And that was my big concern. I went up, we talked to Senator Ben Allen. I went up to Sacramento and talked to Tina Andolina, who was really, really involved in the actual crafting of the legislation. And this is where she gave kudos to you, Heidi, about, well, there's oversight, because Cal Recycle gets to basically complete oversight of Pro. So Rachel, you are empowered, and it seems like, from what I'm reading, you get to hire a lot of people in the coming years.
We're already hiring.
We already did the hiring. There's an urgent need to get this implemented, and we jumped to as soon as the governor signed it. But so this is a different regulatory framework. Typically, when government regulates anything, you set up a very constrained set of rules, and you say these are all of the steps you have to take to meet the goal. And the extended producer responsibility, we set up the objective. So you just saw, and Heidi walked us through the objective: 65% recycling by 2032, 100% recyclable by 2032, source reduction, etc. We say that's where you have to get, and we're going to tell you what that means, but then you go figure out how to get there. And so then you allow a lot of space for people to innovate, as we're seeing here, to figure out what other materials can come to the market. And rather than us doing what I like to refer to the whack-a-mole of enforcement, of going after people and saying, no, your product isn't recyclable, or this is what it should look like, we say, no, you figure out how to get there, go find the better product, it's out there, and meet the objectives.
So I'm a plastic producer selling a plastic product, like maybe something single use. I package something in single use.
Yeah.
I live in California, my business in California. I have to join the Pro.
Yes.
Okay. Tell me what that means.
So the Pro will be established early next year. And what that will mean is that every manufacturer who sells into California that has a product or that is selling a single-use packaging product, so plastic or anything else, has to participate in the Pro. That means that that organization is going to represent you in the California market, and when your product doesn't meet the objective by 2032, we go to the Pro and we say, that product can't be sold here, or you as an organization are going to pay $10,000 a day fine for allowing that product into the state of California. So it has a pretty significant piece to it. But everybody, it's about bringing the industry together to say, no, as we were talking about today, systemic change, the way you get this done is everybody comes together, hopefully sharing some of the technologies and opportunities, and as an industry, we're going to hold you accountable.
Okay, so Caroline, this gets me to our next slide. And this is the fun part of this whole thing. Let the rulemaking begin, right? Because this is where we are now. Number one, we're deciding who's going to be running the pro, the actual operational part of the pro, right? Which, has that been decided yet or no?
No, so the applications, the statute provides that applications can be accepted until January 1st. So
Okay.
we can't decide that until after January 1st.
Is it materials that are supposed to be covered by this law are supposed to be defined by January 1st?
So by January 1st, we will also be putting out early in the new year, putting out the covered materials list as well. Yeah.
So that's really the first thing.
That's the first thing. The other thing that we're working on that did not have a specific statutory deadline is the needs assessment. A lot of very bureaucratic words today. The needs assessment does an evaluation. We're doing an evaluation right now of all of the infrastructure that exists in the state of California and identifying the gaps
Gotcha.
that the pro is going to have to fill.
So I told Caroline I would give her dream today. I said, Caroline, if I could make you czar, if you could run Calorie Cycle and the pro, how would you design the perfect system? What would be your priorities?
It's the biggest promotion I've ever gotten. This is huge. In a day, amazing. 2 years in Atlantic, and then you're the czar of EPR. Okay, so the first thing I'll tell you is what I would do if I were the pro and I were evil. Okay, if I were evil,
It's a good exercise.
right?
I like this.
We do this exercise sometimes.
This is a helpful exercise. Like if I'm the PRO and I'm evil, I'm going to try to bamboozle you. And here's what I'm going to try to do. I am going to throw all of the ways that something can be sustainable at you, and then decide to kind of jerry-rig the fee structure so that it works in my favor. So just as an example, I won't get into all of the life cycle assessment stuff, but just as an example, like a plastic grocery bag and a paper grocery bag. The paper grocery bag, we can recycle it. We're very happy about that. The plastic grocery bag, we can't really recycle it very well, but it has a very low carbon footprint, lower than the paper grocery bag. This is an unfortunate reality of our time. I think it's fixable, but we'll get to that later. If I'm trying to bamboozle you, what I say is, well, you know what? I really think that we should incentivize the lowest carbon footprint option. And then I incentivize the use of the plastic bag that we're already using. And I'm not saying that we have to pit all of our sustainability goals against each other. What I do think is that we need to focus. And the focus of EPR, as I understand it, Heidi can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the goal here was circularity. The goal here was recyclable materials, increasing the recycling rate, and then getting a lot of this pollution out of our oceans and off of our highways. And so if my goal is circularity, then I need to make sure that that's what I'm incentivizing for. So we need to look at all of these materials, and packaging's a big spectrum of materials. Like, I mean, there's EPR for paint, mattresses, and tires. These are all pretty singular groups of materials. Packaging, big group of materials. So we need to step back and think about what does it look like for each of these things to be circular? And then we need to make sure that's what we're incentivizing for. So if I'm Cal Recycle, I am looking at the PRO's plan and looking for, are you actually trying to incentivize circularity? That has to be the focus. And the second thing think we have to do, you did make me czar, so there are multiple parts of this list.
I will shut up until you're done.
It's not just given to being czar.
The other thing I think that we need to do is break down all of the different big groups of packaging that we're going to be dealing with. What works to incentivize circularity for shopping bags is going to be very different than what incentivizes circularity for poultry packaging. I don't see a world anytime soon in which we're going to be packaging raw chicken in paper. It's just not a reality. And even if we did, that paper isn't recyclable. It's covered in chicken guts. Like, it's not going to happen. So for certain kinds of food packaging, what does circularity look like? It's probably going to look like compostable materials. So I think that we're going to need to look at these big groups of packaging applications and say, what is it we want to incentivize, and then help the PRO, help all of these producers actually all move in the same direction towards circularity for that application. So do I get the job?
Yeah.
Is it?
I think you have a leg up. You're doing great on the interview thing. So one of the things Rachel, really quick with you, when we talked to Senator Allen, he was saying that, you know, the legislation calls for one pro to start. But to Caroline's point, as we evolve, there's probably going to break it off into little pros for each segment of the market. Is that the way you see it?
I think that that's highly likely. The legislation contemplates in a few years that the PRO you could have multiple, and an application would go through. And I kind of see, you know, on an annual basis, our initial estimates are that there are 250 billion units of packaging sold into the state of California right now. When you think about what that means and how many entities that is, I think what we're looking at is eventually they're going to want to group themselves into similar packaging and similar recycling structures or collection structures, et cetera. And I think eventually that's what's going to happen. But I think getting the initial plan forward is going to be such a Herculean effort that you need the industries as a whole to come together to build that first plan.
Great. Listen, my last slide, and then we'll get to questions, because I see Dave over there going, hey, whoop. But this is really one of the most important things, which is designing with the end of life in mind. And I forgot to change that on my slide. Sorry, Carolyn. End of life. And John, this is all you in terms of like your product and what you're trying to do. And I think one of the big risk factors, obviously, for a startup like yourself, new technology, is how are you going to get treated? How do we make sure you don't get buried?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. And, you know, to touch on the first thing, I think it's incredibly important to design for things to disappear and to do it in a way where it works, you know, for our product, Cruz Foam, which is looking to replace styrofoam, polyethylene, polypropylene, different types of plastic foams, both in cold chain e-commerce and protection. One of the big things is understanding that, to Caroline's point, you know, a lot of foam is not recyclable. How do we understand for that specific application, maybe for food, the foam, you know, end of life is going to be different than maybe for a foam we make for a construction application or a different type. I mean, it's not packaging, but we're looking at materials in general. And so as we evolve as a company over time, what's really important for us to be successful is to have clear direction from regulators and legislation, but do it in a way where, as Rachel said, it brings all the stakeholders to the table. Because what's really failed, I think, and really been detrimental for biomaterials or just kind of novel materials in general, is that's been short-sighted in the past. And people would look to innovate, but didn't realize how a material would actually break down in a MRF, how it actually would be collected. And now there's this, I would say, hesitation across the stakeholder system to adopt these materials because A, they don't actually know what they are, and B, they don't know the infrastructure legislation that's going to support them by adopting and implementing these at scale. And so when we look at the large organizations we work with, global organizations, huge companies, it's really understanding that this, you know, starts in California, and that's where we want to make sure that legislation supports our early growth and traction into making, you know, an impact as an early stage company. But we see this as a global problem. It is a supply chain problem. And it's really about activating that in a way where, great if it works in California, but we're also thinking about everywhere else. And so when we look at our material, we design it to really disappear in the natural world. We know a lot of these packaging materials are not going to end up in the right end of lives. We need to shoot for that, and we need to make sure we have alignment to make sure innovation is supported to reach that goal. But it's challenging, and I think EPR and where this is going is long overdue. And I think I wanted to touch on quickly your first question, what scares me the most? You kind of all said flavors of it. It's the oversaturation. We already are past the saturation level on this planet for man-made materials. It happened in 2020. Mm-hmm. It surpassed all human or all living biomass. The man-made materials we made is blanketing the earth. And what worries me the most isn't necessarily that, it's the fact that it's already happened and we're not moving quick enough to change it. And for me, the biggest thing that's held that up is the misalignment of these stakeholders, honestly, to allow proper innovation. And I think, to Heidi's point, that's been on purpose.
The one thing I really wanted to leave here with is that, our worlds have to come together. Listening to the earlier panels and the influence that the outdoor industry can have on a huge chunk of people that can make such a big difference politically. I got involved in this because I picked up trash as a kid. I always hated litter. I hate waste. And I'm passionate about it. We have to all work together to get enough people to put political pressure to get things done and change things. Anyway, I'm very excited to be here, and I just really hope we can all work together in the future, and this is just the beginning.
Thank you, and I just I'll wrap this up with just say, the power of, the Momentum Group and New Earth Project, Enoch, you guys, to convene this panel right here and get this group together, because I know you guys are probably gonna geek out hopefully afterwards. This is just a very sort of starter discussion, but I want you guys to know that we, the creators, are very invested in this, the outdoor community. We are watching, we are following, we are gonna be paying attention to how this thing is all going. Caroline is my little police officer. So, and we're gonna have fun telling the story and about this transition, because it's a great one. So thank you all for the role you're playing. It's so important, and we really